To be completely honest, this story is true, though I know you'll probably think it's nothing but a wild fabrication. I wouldn't blame you if you did. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I'd likely dismiss it too. It sounds like something straight out of a Stephen King novel, which is ironic because this incident is what first drew me to his books. I've followed this channel for a while, and you seem to be more open to these strange, inexplicable tales than most other horror narration channels. There's a common thread in stories like these. They always seem to unfold when you're alone, usually in the dead of night, which is precisely how my unbelievable experience played out. A little about me. I'm a journalist for a major publication, so writing is my trade. I apologize if this comes across more like a fictional story than a genuine account, but I'll do my best to stay grounded and concise. Remember, anything you hear online should be taken with a grain of salt. I don't expect you to believe my story, but I hope you'll at least keep an open mind. It was the fall of 2006 in Austin, Texas, my hometown. I was a senior in high school, and at the time, I was stuck walking to and from school every day because my Chevy Malibu's transmission had gone out. I was saving up for a new car before heading off to college the next year, so I had no choice but to hoof it. One morning, during homeroom, the entire school was summoned to the gym for an important announcement. Once we were all seated, our principal, Mr. Keller, stepped up to the podium and delivered some grim news through the crackling PA system. He informed us that a freshman girl named Stephanie had been killed in a hit-and-run the day before. I had vaguely heard about it on the radio but didn't know the details until then. It was tragic, but also deeply unsettling. I didn't know Stephanie personally, but the thought that some deranged person was prowling around, targeting high schoolers, made me worry that I could be next. I was one of the few seniors who walked home after school, and with most of my friends either taking the bus or heading straight to after-school jobs, I had no one to catch a ride with. And the bus? Let's just say that wasn't an option for reasons I'd rather not get into. My house was about a 20-minute walk from the school, not too far, but the route I took led down some isolated back roads where someone could easily vanish. Despite the eerie circumstances, I tried to dismiss the idea that someone had intentionally killed the girl. Austin was known for its share of reckless drivers, and it seemed more likely that it was just a tragic accident. I felt awful for Stephanie and hoped the police would find whoever was responsible. A week later, the school held a memorial for Stephanie, and while the police continued their investigation, the community had mostly moved on. It was a Friday, and my friend Mike and I decided to hang out at his place after school. His older brother Roger got us some alcohol, and we spent the evening on the back porch, chatting and playing darts. Before I knew it, it was midnight. I had some work-related tasks to handle the next day, so I didn't want to crash at Mike's place. Besides, my house was only about a 15-minute walk away. Mike had passed out on the porch, and I lied to Roger, telling him my dad was coming to pick me up. The truth was, I didn't want to trouble him for a ride, and he wasn't exactly in the best shape to drive either. I had been drinking, but I wasn't drunk. After drawing a mustache on Mike's face with a black marker, I said goodbye to Roger and started walking home. The route I took included a dark, narrow back street that connected my neighborhood to Mike's. This road stretched for about half a mile, and once you reached the end, my house was just around the corner. The street was almost pitch black at night, with a few old-fashioned lamp posts lining the sidewalk, most of which didn't work, and those that did offered little light. I rarely took this road on my walks home from school, and I almost never wandered Austin's streets so late at night. Given the circumstances, I was understandably on edge. I was about halfway down the road when, suddenly, all the lamp posts went out at once. "Just great," I muttered, feeling a growing sense of unease. I stood still for a few minutes, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The night sky was devoid of moonlight, so I could barely see a thing. Eventually, I continued walking, and the tree line on my right opened up, allowing some distant floodlights to cast a faint glow over the road, just enough for me to see where I was going. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A car engine roared to life, followed by a loud rattling noise. It was the kind of sound you might hear at a vintage car show, but in the middle of the night, on an isolated road, it was terrifying. I immediately thought of Stephanie and began scanning my surroundings for the source of the noise. There were no headlights in sight, but the sound was close, suggesting that whoever started the car was on the same road as me. The engine revved again, confirming my worst fears. It wasn't just a show-off rev, it was more aggressive, almost predatory. I reached a part of the road where the floodlights were blocked by a large stone wall leading to my neighborhood's entrance. The road curved ahead, creating a dark void, and I was certain the rattling noise was coming from there. I dreaded the idea of walking toward it, so I decided to wait and see what would happen. My rational mind tried to convince me it was just a prank, but the palpable danger emanating from the darkness suggested otherwise. I slowly crossed to the other side of the road, closer to one of the lamp posts. As soon as I reached it, the engine abruptly stopped. I stared into the darkness, my heart pounding, sensing that something was about to happen. Suddenly, I was blinded by a pair of headlights as a car shot out of the blackness, charging toward me like a missile locked onto its target. The blinding light and roaring engine left me stunned, with only seconds to react before it would have plowed into me with the force of a freight train. I leaped back onto the open road, narrowly avoiding the car's metal frame. I hit the pavement hard, the sound of screeching tires ringing in my ears. I quickly got up, expecting the car to come at me again, but when I looked around, there was nothing. The street was empty. The lamp posts that had left me in near darkness were now partially lit again. I was dumbstruck. What the hell just happened? There was no way a car that close could have vanished into thin air without so much as a fading headlight. In the moments that followed, I wasn't sure what to do. Once the shock subsided, I decided the best course of action was to get home as fast as possible. I ran through all the possibilities in my head. Maybe I'd had more to drink than I thought and had almost been hit by a passing car. But that didn't add up. I've been completely wasted before, and I was nowhere near that point that night. The engine revving in the dark had been enough to sober me up in an instant. I distinctly remember the headlights bearing down on me and my life flashing before my eyes just before I jumped out of the way. The car's engine sounded like a beast. Someone had clearly put a lot of work into it. I only caught a quick glimpse of what was behind the headlights, but I'm certain it was one of those classic muscle cars, maybe a GTO or an old Camaro. But what still baffles me is how it seemed to disappear the moment I jumped out of its path. I hit the ground, heard the tires screech, and then, nothing. I never told anyone about what happened. What was I supposed to say? That I was almost run down by a ghost car? To this day, I still don't know what to make of it. Sometimes I wonder if it was just a freakish nightmare, but deep down, I know that's bullshit. It's worth noting that the police never found the car that hit Stephanie. Her death remains unsolved. Let me give you some context before I dive into what happened. It was the summer of 2014. I was 22, about to turn 23 that fall. I'd prefer not to disclose my location, so I'll be making a few slight changes for privacy. I live in a small college town where I've spent my entire life and from where I graduated. This town has a rich history, though unfortunately, it also struggles with a drug problem. Aside from that, we don't see much chaos around here. I worked at a gas station owned by a relative, and my husband and I worked opposite shifts. I'm an early riser, so I took the morning shift. My day would start around 3:30 or 4 a.m., and I'd open the store by 5. Walking to my car in the dark never bothered me. I grew up in the countryside, just outside of town. I always loved being outdoors, even in the dead of night. I'd lie in the grass, staring up at the stars. My friends and I would play games like Ghost in the Graveyard after dark and indulge in typical teenage mischief. We had about 4 acres of land, and no one ever disturbed us. Being outside at night never frightened me. However, living in an apartment complex is a different experience. I've never been much of a city person, even now. But now that you've got the background, let's get into the story. This tale is in 2 parts, so stay with me, as both incidents happen close together. As I mentioned, it was the summer of 2014. I was getting ready for work as usual when I climbed into my car and started backing out of my apartment's driveway. That's when I noticed a man walking down the road, dragging a suitcase behind him. The sight was strange. Why would anyone be strolling down the street with a suitcase at 4:40 in the morning? I briefly considered pulling up next to him to ask if he needed help or if I should call the police, but something about him made me uneasy. I was raised with the rule of not talking to strangers or picking up hitchhikers, so letting a stranger into my car was out of the question. Still, I'm a kind person, always willing to lend a hand, but not at the risk of my safety. As I pulled out of the driveway, the man began walking directly toward my car. A chill ran down my spine, and I immediately drove off down the street. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw him just standing there, watching me. Something about him felt wrong, and I was relieved I didn't offer to help. Some might think I was overreacting, but really, why would someone be walking with a suitcase in the middle of the street at that hour? Once I reached work, I called the police to report the incident, explaining that I was a concerned resident and had never seen this man before in my 4 years living there. They assured me they'd send a car to patrol the area. Hours passed without any word, so I called them back to follow up, but they said they found no trace of the man. I shrugged it off and went about my day. Later, I mentioned it to my husband after my shift, and he suggested it was probably someone returning from the airport or something, even though the nearest airport was about an hour away. He thought I was making a big deal out of nothing. A few weeks later, I was chatting with a customer and brought up the incident. In a small town like ours, everyone talks. As soon as I mentioned the man with the suitcase, my customer's face went pale. He then told me the police had recently discovered bodies stuffed in suitcases in our county. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my heart raced. He asked if I remembered what the man looked like, but I hadn't gotten a good look. I'm not certain if the man I saw was the suitcase killer, but I'm grateful I didn't stop to help. A couple of months later, I was again getting ready for work. I headed out the back door of my apartment. My husband and I lived at the end of the hallway, so I decided to park my car close to the back door for convenience, avoiding the walk down the long hallway. Besides, the front parking spots were usually taken. When you exit the back door, a row of large pine trees lines a cement pathway leading to the back parking lot. It was still dark outside, and as soon as I opened the door, I saw the dark figure of a large man sprinting straight toward me. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut and rushed back into the apartment. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was in full flight mode. I've never run so fast in my life. When I reached the bedroom, my husband shot up from the bed, asking if I was okay. After I explained what happened, he immediately went to the door and peered through the peephole. He saw nothing, so he cracked the door open and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. I was still shaking when he walked me out to my car. I'm lucky to have such a great guy for a husband. Later that day, when he arrived at the gas station for his shift, He told me to park in the front from now on, where the lights were. That same week, I bought some pepper spray, just in case. It's been 7 years, and thankfully, I've never had to use it. But I want to warn you all, even if you feel safe in your neighborhood, you still need to take precautions. Park in well-lit areas if you're heading to work early like me. Always carry some form of protection and stay alert. You never know who might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for you to let your guard down. There are a lot of dangerous people out there, and you need to be cautious. If something feels off, trust your instincts. When I was 21, I moved in with my ex-boyfriend in Southern California. It was the first time I had true independence, free from my parents' constant oversight, which led me to take some risks. We lived in what was thought to be a safe neighborhood, with pleasant homes lining the streets and Cal State University nearby. Crime was rare, so we never felt unsafe. One warm Friday night in July, around 1 a.m., we were restless in our overheated apartment and decided to go for a walk. We headed to a nearby park with an artificial lake where ducks and geese often gathered. The park, surrounded by tall trees and thick bushes, offered a sense of peaceful seclusion. The clear sky and bright moon made the summer night in Orange County feel serene. My boyfriend was slender with long hair, and I was 5 feet 5 inches and weighed about 100 pounds back then. We found a bench near the lake and sat down, watching the water shimmer under the moonlight. Suddenly, the darkness was shattered by the glare of headlights as a police cruiser sped into the parking lot, bouncing over speed bumps, red and blue lights flashing. The car screeched to a halt, and a spotlight pierced through the trees. We froze, thinking, we're not supposed to be here. What should we do? We might have been slightly intoxicated, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Knowing the police had spotted us, we decided not to move, fearing that running would only lead to more trouble. The officer didn't approach us right away, and we watched anxiously, trying to figure out what was going on. We speculated that the officer might have interrupted something illegal, but we couldn't see much through the trees. Eventually, the cop came over to us, and we braced ourselves for a reprimand or worse, a fine for being in the park after hours. What he told us, however, was far more horrifying. During his patrol, he had noticed a man hiding in the trees, watching us closely. The officer explained that the man likely mistook us both for women, given my boyfriend's long hair and slim build. My boyfriend's pride took a hit, but that was the least of our worries. The cop had seen the man slowly inching closer to us, prompting him to act. When he apprehended the man, he found a disturbing array of weapons, a collection of knives, handcuffs, zip ties, duct tape, and a gun, the makings of a kidnapper's toolkit. Fear gripped me as I realized how narrowly we had escaped a nightmare. We were incredibly fortunate that the officer had spotted the man lurking in the shadows because our fate could have been far worse. We thanked the officer and walked back to our apartment in silence, shaken to the core. I'm deeply grateful to be alive today, and we never set foot in that park again. When I was 16, sneaking out late at night to explore abandoned places with my friends Aaron and Tristan was something we did regularly. We lived in a small Irish town, and one night, after spending 2 hours playing Call of Duty, we decided to check out an old gas station we had found earlier that week. The gas station was down a neglected road, thick with overgrowth and completely unlit. As we got closer, Tristan spotted a car parked in the far corner of the lot. It was an old, gray Nissan, and we couldn't understand how it had gotten through the dense road. Tristan seemed uneasy, suggesting we should leave, but Aaron teased him for being scared. I played along, but deep down, I felt that something about the car was off. We approached the Nissan, noticing that it was in surprisingly good condition. That should have been a warning sign, but we ignored it and continued towards the gas station. The front door and all the windows were sealed with boards, so we walked around the building until we found the back door, secured with a flimsy old lock. Aaron grabbed a piece of a broken fence and smashed the lock until it broke. As he opened the door, a jingling sound echoed inside, startling us, but we quickly realized it was just a bell attached to the door. Inside, the gas station was a mess, scattered debris and empty shelves. We explored the first floor quickly and then headed upstairs. The upper level was just a large office space with a few desks, chairs, and a table in the center. Aaron pulled out 3 bottles of beer, and we started to relax, pulling some chairs together and talking. Our conversation was cut short when we heard a sound that we first thought was police sirens, but soon realized was the alarm of the Nissan outside. I looked through a gap in the boarded-up window and saw a large, bald man standing beside the car. I was so shocked that I dropped my bottle, which shattered on the floor. The man turned towards the sound, and we quickly hid under the table, our hearts racing as we waited in silence until the alarm finally stopped. Then, we heard the door downstairs creak open, followed by the sound of the bells jingling again. My heart pounded as the man called out, "I know you're in here." He began shouting, accusing us of damaging his car, even though we hadn't touched it. We could hear his heavy footsteps slowly ascending the stairs. From our hiding spot, I caught a glimpse of him. He was big and intimidating, and it was clear he could easily overpower us. He started to search the room, taunting us with a sinister voice, saying, come out, wherever you are." As he moved closer to the table, Aaron did something completely unexpected. He leaped out from under the table and smashed his beer bottle over the man's head, causing him to collapse. A large knife slipped from his hand as he fell. We didn't waste a second. We ran out of the building as fast as we could, hearing the man's footsteps chasing after us. We sprinted through the woods until we finally made it back to my house. I had never felt so relieved to be safe. 2 years have passed since that terrifying night, and I still can't help but wonder what would have happened if that unhinged man had caught us. It's a question I'm not sure I ever want to answer. I grew up in a modest-sized town, just a 45-minute drive from the second-largest city in our state, known for its rivers and countless bridges. I'm the youngest of 3 boys. My mother managed my grandfather's golf course, and my father was a state police lieutenant. We weren't rich, but we never struggled financially. My dad, a strict cop, made sure my brothers and I were always respectful, no matter the situation. Because of some family issues that I prefer not to discuss, I was never particularly close with my brothers or parents. However, the events that unfolded made me appreciate my father more than ever. The one thing we all had in common was a deep commitment to protecting our loved ones, no matter the cost. One day, I went downtown to hang out with some friends, a spot about half a mile from the high school's football stadium. We were teenagers at the time, so we all rode our bikes. After some time, I realized my bike was missing. My friends and I searched the area, but it was nowhere to be found. I called my dad, knowing he was home from work. He drove down to meet me, and to our surprise, he wasn't angry. Maybe he was just in a good mood that day. My friends headed home on their bikes, promising to keep an eye out for mine. As my dad and I were driving back, we spotted 3 people, 2 guys and a girl, walking down a side street. One of the guys was pushing my bike. I immediately told my dad, "They have my bike." He pulled over, and we jumped out. I couldn't help but laugh inside as I watched my dad go full-on cop mode on those kids. He had the girl and one of the guys stand against a wall while he slammed the guy holding my bike to the ground. I quickly grabbed my bike and loaded it into the back of my dad's truck. Since it was just the 2 of us against 3 of them, my dad told me to get in the truck so they wouldn't see my face. but I stubbornly refused, staying outside until the police arrived and arrested all three of them. A decision I would later come to regret. Fast forward 2 years, and I was 18, freshly returned from military school. One evening, around 6 p.m., I was out jogging when a car sped past me, only to slow down and stop at a sign down the road. Something about it felt off, so I memorized the car's details as best I could as I continued jogging home. The car eventually drove past my house, moving slowly. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming the driver was just lost. About a week later, after another jog, I walked into my house, heading straight for the kitchen to splash some water on my face. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from outside, followed by 3 more in quick succession. I recognized the sound of gunfire instantly. I dropped to the floor and crawled to the door, grabbing one of my brother's baseball bats before running outside. I knew a bat was no match for a gun, but I hoped to catch the shooter off guard. By the time I made it outside, I saw the taillights of a car disappearing down the street, the same car I had seen a week earlier. Thankfully, no one else was home. Word spread quickly in our town, and my brothers joked about my so-called heroics, asking if I tried to play the hero when no one was around. They thought I was crazy for running towards gunfire with just a baseball bat. A few days later, the police called to inform us they had caught the shooter. It turned out to be the same guy who had stolen my bike 2.5 years earlier. He was sentenced to 10 years for attempted murder. Later, I learned he had been released early. Life went on, and I eventually became an EMT. At 26, I returned to my hometown to visit my parents. When I walked into the kitchen, I saw a newspaper on the table. The front page headline read, "Local woman missing, vehicle found abandoned." As I read through the article, rage boiled inside me. The missing woman's boyfriend was the same guy who had stolen my bike and shot at our house years ago. He hadn't been arrested or charged in connection with the missing woman. From that day on, I made sure to carry a pistol everywhere I went, except when I was on duty. I distanced myself from my family for a while, battling paranoia. But as they say, life goes on. I still work as an EMT, and the guy who shot at my house is back in prison, this time for charges unrelated to the missing woman, who was later found dead. In 2014, I became part of a Facebook group that catered to people from the small town where I spent my childhood in Southern California. The group was mostly filled with pleasant conversations and shared memories. Everyone seemed friendly, except for one individual. There's always one person who stirs up trouble. This particular man got into a dispute with one of the group's admins, Robert, and was eventually removed. At that time, I was in my mid-30s, while most of the other members were at least 2 decades older than me. Robert was nearing 60, married with children close to my age. He appeared to take a special interest in me, and because he was married, I assumed his attention was harmless. I was wrong. Robert often complimented me, saying I was easygoing and relatable. We exchanged phone numbers, and he began messaging me frequently. But soon, his behavior crossed a line. Robert started digging into my personal life, finding out where I lived, my landline number, and even my mother's address in California. He subscribed to a service that provided personal information, including people's ages, phone numbers, possible relatives, and previous addresses. Through Facebook, he discovered my birthday and sent me flowers. Although I thanked him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He began to confide in me, complaining that his wife was only interested in his pain medication and money. Around this time, I met the man who would later become my husband, and I shared the news on Facebook. Robert's reaction was terrifying. He flew into a rage, claiming I should have known he was in love with me. I reminded him that he was married, asking how he could be in love with another woman. But this only fueled his obsession. He started sending me a barrage of text messages, sometimes as many as 20 in a day, alternating between insulting me and pleading for forgiveness. I blocked his number, but Robert found another way to reach me by calling my landline incessantly. I kept the phone unplugged most of the time to avoid his voicemails, but curiosity got the better of me one day, and I listened to a few. In one message, he accused me of owing him $13,000 and began threatening to visit my home and my mother's house. Alarmed, I blocked his number on my landline and warned my mother about the situation. Robert didn't stop there. He started sending text messages from random numbers across California and even mailed letters to my home, filled with bizarre and nonsensical ramblings. I decided it was time to take legal action and sought a restraining order. I tried twice through my county court, but because I was living in Washington state at the time, the judge wouldn't grant it due to the fact that Robert and I were in different states. When Robert found out that I couldn't secure a restraining order, his harassment escalated. He sent more menacing messages, boasting that I'd never be able to escape him. Undeterred, I went back to court with new evidence. Robert, trying to defend himself, sent a letter claiming he was a civil servant who had once worked for a school district and was an electrician by trade. He said he was on disability and couldn't drive for more than 30 minutes without severe pain, questioning how he could possibly travel to Washington state. I knew this wasn't true, as he frequently posted on Facebook about his motorcycle trips to Malibu. Despite presenting this evidence, the judge still denied my request for a restraining order, leaving me feeling abandoned by the system. I blocked Robert on all social media, emails, and phone numbers, but he continued to harass me, finding new ways to get in touch. He created a fake Facebook profile using my picture and sent friend requests to all my contacts. I only found out when a friend messaged me, confused about receiving a friend request from me despite already being connected. My friend reported the fake profile, and thankfully, Facebook removed it. I changed my phone number and eventually moved to a new place. Things quieted down for a while, but Robert somehow tracked me down on LinkedIn. That was the final straw. I deleted my LinkedIn account, deactivated my Facebook, and discovered he had even followed me on YouTube. Unable to remove him, I blocked him there as well. To give you a sense of how unhinged this situation became, I've included a few recordings of the messages he left me. Please, respond to me. Would you consider that? It's the Christian thing to do, don't you think? Please, I'm not playing around. Bye. Look, if you don't respond to me, you're not leaving me too many choices here, and it only leaves me with one. I don't want to do it. I wish you'd just talk to me, we could work this out. But clearly, you don't want that. You're not leaving me much of a choice, and I won't be going after a paycheck. My name is Caitlin, and I'm 21 now, but when this all happened, I was 19. I had just moved into my parents' 2-bedroom apartment in Kentucky with my 2 dogs, Kylo and Finn. My boyfriend, Isaac, and my friend, Aaron, moved in with me soon after, splitting the rent. The area wasn't great, there were always addicts roaming around at night, but it was affordable, and I could keep my dogs, so it worked out. To set the scene, I need to explain a bit about the apartment layout. The building had 3 stories, with the basement housing 2 apartments and a parking garage. Stairs led to the 2nd floor, which had 4 apartments, including mine, located immediately to the left as you reached the landing. Beside my door was another set of stairs that led up to the 3rd floor. My unit was technically on the ground level, and we had a small yard, something that was rare for apartments in this building. One night, Isaac and I took the dogs out for their usual walk before bed. We went around the building because my dogs, Kylo and Finn, aren't exactly welcoming to strangers, and someone had just pulled up in front of the building. Kylo and Finn are both border collies, each weighing about 45 pounds, and while they might not look threatening, Their deep barks often gave people the wrong idea. I always tried to be cautious, especially around neighbors and their kids. I didn't want to risk an incident or, worse, a lawsuit. While the dogs were sniffing around, I noticed a guy in a pink shirt leaning against the wall of the vacant apartment across from mine. The apartment had been empty for a while and was mostly used for storage, so seeing someone there at night immediately raised a red flag. Still, I decided to ignore him. But then, the man called out to us, "Hey!" We kept our heads down, pretending not to hear. I didn't know who he was, and my dogs weren't exactly friendly with strangers. Sure enough, Finn picked up on the tension and began growling, with Kylo quickly following suit. I whispered to Isaac, "Let's avoid this guy and head back around the front." As we tried to steer clear, the dogs suddenly barked again. This time, the man in the pink shirt was standing by the building's entrance, watching us. We had walked further into another part of the yard, but somehow, he had reappeared closer to us. He must have been watching the entire time, which made the situation even more unsettling. The moment we noticed him, he slipped behind the building and vanished from view. We finished walking the dogs and headed back inside, but as we reached the door, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't alone. Another guy wearing glasses was with him, and both of them were running up the back stairwell toward us. In a panic, I rushed Isaac and the dogs inside, slamming the door shut and locking it just as they reached the top. At this point, we hadn't lived there long, but I'd gotten to know a few of the neighbors. None of them seemed like these two. Just as I started to catch my breath, there were 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw them, standing right outside. I had no intention of opening the door, but they knocked again, and again. Instead of leaving, they began pounding on the door, yelling for us to open up. "Open the damn door," one of them screamed. Aaron, who had heard the commotion, came out of his room and started watching the back windows while Isaac kept an eye on the front door. The banging and shouting finally died down, but the relief didn't last. Suddenly, Aaron yelled, "They're at the windows. I think they're trying to get inside." Moments later, we heard a loud thud as a rock hit one of the windows. It was terrifying. Who were these people, and why were they targeting us? Then came a new sound, scratching at the front door. Isaac checked through the peephole and saw the man in glasses standing just out of view, right next to the door, continuing the scratching noise and occasionally throwing things at our windows. We were too afraid to call the police. We had paraphernalia lying around, and the paranoia from earlier that day clouded our judgment. Instead, I slipped to the back of the apartment and called my parents. My dad is a big guy, 6 feet 3 inches and built like a tank. My mom picked up the phone, and after I explained what was happening, she immediately called my cousin, who lived closer to me and also happened to own a gun. He rushed over in his Jeep and parked across the street, giving him a clear view of the building. From there, he saw the men running around, trying to find a way inside. At one point, one of them even attempted to climb up the balcony. My mom told my cousin to wait until she and my dad arrived before doing anything. Meanwhile, the harassment continued for nearly 40 minutes. Eventually, my cousin lost sight of them, and that's when my parents arrived. As they pulled up, they found a group of people in a circle, beating the guy in the pink shirt. I ran outside and watched as my mom jumped out of the car, yelling, "Who the hell was knocking on my daughter's door?" The crowd scattered, and the man in glasses pointed at the guy in pink, now bloodied and on the ground. My dad walked over and asked the guy what his problem was. He stammered out a weak apology, saying, "I didn't mean to." My dad, clearly not impressed, asked why they had kept it up for an hour. After some more mumbling, my dad picked him up by the shirt and threw him at least 4 feet away, shouting for him to stay away from the apartments. Soon after, the cops arrived, but the call they received wasn't about our ordeal. Someone had reported the group fight, but when they inspected our door, they found deep scratch marks, likely from a knife. The officers explained that the guy in the pink shirt had mistaken Isaac for someone else he had a grudge against, someone who lived in the building next door. We moved out after our lease ended. Aaron went back to his home state, and Isaac and I moved in with my parents. A few months later, my mom found an article about the guy. His name was Isaiah Harvey, and he had burned down a house in a nearby town. I'm just grateful we didn't open the door that night, and my dog stayed safe inside. I'll never forget how fast my dad and cousin came to our rescue. As a final note, always trust your instincts. If someone gives you a bad vibe, it's best to stay far away. It was the summer of 2019, and although I live in Morgan Hill, California, this event unfolded in the nearby town of Gilroy. Every year, Gilroy hosts a festival to attract visitors, help local businesses, and generate some income. As a child, my family and I attended regularly, but over time, the festival began to feel sketchy. I was 21 at the time, and my boyfriend Will and I decided to meet my aunt and cousin at their booth, as it was their first year participating as vendors, and I wanted to support them. A few key things to note. First, it was Will's first time attending. Second, my cousin was 8 months pregnant. And third, her eldest daughter chose not to attend that day, staying home with my uncle, whose house was just a short walk from the festival grounds. We parked at my uncle's place, greeted everyone, and headed to the event. Thanks to my aunt, we got in without paying. It was clear right away that security wasn't tight. Will had a multi-tool on his belt, but nobody checked him, and I wasn't searched either. After pushing through the crowds, we finally made it to my family's tent. After about 25 minutes, my cousin left to use the bathroom, and Will wandered off to explore another booth, leaving me chatting with my aunt. Then, a loud bang echoed through the area. At first, people thought it might be coming from a nearby bounce house or perhaps a firecracker, but I had a gut feeling something was off. My eyes met my aunt's, and within moments, gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through the festival as panic set in. People were screaming, running in all directions, desperately trying to escape. I dropped to the ground, like everyone else, but then noticed 2 young children frozen in place. Without thinking, I shielded them with my body. Their mother soon rushed over and threw herself on top of us to protect us all. After a while, they crawled to safety behind an overturned table, while I stayed flat, watching my aunt. Her desperate calls for my cousin made my heart pound harder. In moments like this, people either fight or flee, and I chose to fight. I jumped up, calling for my cousin, trying to make my way toward the bathrooms. Bullets were still flying, and I tried to keep low as I moved, but before I got far, Will grabbed me by the ankle and pulled me under a table. Will is usually calm under pressure, but seeing his face drained of color made my blood run cold. I heard a whistle, followed by something hitting my head. When I reached up, I realized it was a bullet casing. We hadn't even noticed how close we were to the shooter. With no time to waste, we both made a run for it. I was moving so fast that one of my shoes flew off. It felt unreal that we hadn't been hit by the gunfire. Just then, the police arrived, exchanging shots with the gunman, forcing him to retreat. It was like my instincts took over. Even though I hadn't run in years due to a knee injury that had ended my track career, my body didn't seem to care. I sprinted like I was back in high school, determined to get to safety. We made it out of the festival, and I immediately called my uncle, who urged us to return to his house. When we reached him, I collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably, terrified because I couldn't find my aunt or cousin. 15 minutes later, my aunt and her friend appeared, and we all hugged and cried. But my cousin was still missing. After what felt like forever, we finally heard from her. She had been placed on a bus with some children and taken to a parking lot away from the chaos. When we were reunited, there were more tears. She was unharmed, but she told us that the first shot had landed right by her feet. She looked up to see the shooter reloading, and then chaos erupted. We spent the next 6 hours locked down at my aunt's house. When the police finally let us leave, I held Will's hand tightly all the way home. He had been so close to the shooter when everything happened. He told me how he ran through the tents, flipping tables to reach me. Along the way, he saw a man collapse, shot dead, his girlfriend holding him as he took his last breath. Will still doesn't like to talk about it. I ended up with a black eye, bruises, and a lump on my forehead. Despite everything, I'm grateful that's all I suffered. Months later, the FBI interviewed me, finally returning my missing shoe, explaining that it had taken time because of how close we were to the danger zone. After a year of therapy, I've become more comfortable discussing what happened, although loud noises still make me jump. 3 lives were tragically lost that day, and Gilroy continues to grieve. The town is trying to recover, but with everything else going on, including the pandemic, it may be a long time before the festival returns. That day is something I'll never forget, and I feel incredibly fortunate that my family made it out. If you're interested, you can look up the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting in 2019. Please stay safe. I've decided to submit this under a pseudonym to protect my identity. In the late 90s, I was at a low point in my life, addicted to drugs, wandering aimlessly through the streets of downtown Los Angeles. I scavenged for food from garbage cans, slept beneath bridges, and asked strangers for spare change. When I look back now, I'm filled with regret for that time in my life, but this story isn't about my regret. It's about the night that forced me to change everything. One evening, I was sleeping beneath a remote overpass just outside the city limits. The place was secluded, far from police patrols, and the price of isolation was a long walk back into town. But that was a price I was willing to pay, having survived more than my share of close calls on Skid Row. Exhausted from another day of panhandling, I slipped into my sleeping bag, hoping for a peaceful night. The sound of agonized screams ripped me from my sleep. I turned to see a car parked nearby, its windows down. At first, I thought it might be just a loud couple having fun, but the tone of those screams told me otherwise. These weren't cries of joy, they were the kind of screams that could curdle your blood. From my spot, I could see the faint outline of the scene below, dimly lit by a weak, white light on the fence surrounding the platform under the overpass. I watched in disbelief as the passenger door flew open, and a woman in a revealing outfit staggered out, clutching her leg. She was desperately trying to limp away from the car, her voice pleading for her life. I froze, barely able to comprehend what was happening. Then, the driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. I couldn't make out the person's features from where I was, but the intent was clear. The next thing I knew, the figure aimed a gun at the woman and pulled the trigger. I instinctively closed my eyes, and when I opened them, she was on the ground, sprawled out. Her head was turned toward me, her jaw moving as if she was trying to speak. The image of her lifeless body still haunts me. The shooter calmly walked over to her, now illuminated by the dim light. He was dressed in a dark hoodie, his face obscured by a bandana. He stood over her for what felt like an eternity before firing another shot, ending her life. Panic gripped me. I sat up, covering my mouth, trying to stay silent. But what happened next was even more twisted. At the far end of the overpass, another car's headlights flicked on and approached. For a split second, I felt an absurd sense of relief, thinking help had arrived. But that hope quickly vanished when I realized it was a black van. 3 men in ski masks stepped out, one of them holding a video camera. They had been filming the entire thing. There was a brief exchange between the men before 2 of them walked over to the woman's body. Without hesitation, they grabbed her by the arms and legs, dragging her lifeless form back to the car. The shooter was already at the vehicle, and the cameraman stayed behind, documenting it all. They popped the trunk and tossed her inside as if she were nothing. What happened next was equally horrifying. One of the men returned to the van and brought out 2 cans of gasoline. They drenched the car in fuel, and the shooter struck a match. In seconds, flames engulfed the vehicle. We all watched in silence as the car burned. As I stared into the fire, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer terrified. I was furious at the monsters who had done this, furious that they treated this woman like garbage. Whether she was a drug addict or a prostitute, no one deserves to be slaughtered like that. And to film the whole thing like it was some sick spectacle, it was too much. That was the moment I knew I had to change. I had to get clean, to escape this life before it killed me, too. Once the van drove off, I stumbled out from my hiding place and found the nearest payphone. I called the police, though I don't think they took me seriously at first. But when I led them to the still burning car, their doubts vanished. The detectives questioned me for hours, and yes, they suspected me at first. A homeless junkie witnessing a murder, it wasn't exactly credible, but I stood by my story. They even kept me in a holding cell for a few days, which I didn't mind. Free food and showers? It was a luxury for someone like me. Eventually, they released me, and I later learned that similar killings had occurred in San Francisco and Sacramento. The FBI was involved, and those responsible were wanted nationwide. I never found out if they caught them. I hope they did. That night marked the end of my life on the streets. The fear and anger I felt pushed me to get clean, finish college, and become an English teacher. Now, after 23 years of sobriety, I still reflect on that night. Sometimes, seeing the darkest side of humanity is the only thing that can save you. There's always a reason to be afraid.